Hello, everyone. It's great to have you with us for our part three of holistic formation. And today we're going to be talking about holistic formation and soul. And the way I define soul really grows out of an experience that I had while I was first going into ministry, and that was in the city of Chicago. My wife and I, my brand new wife, after 2 weeks of marriage, ended up in the south side of Chicago. We were the only whites in the church. We were only whites in the neighborhood of a very tough neighborhood in the city of Chicago. And I went in from a background that was totally suburban Dayton, Ohio. So it was a definite cross-cultural experience and a highlight of life and of ministry. We had a wonderful time in that community and in that church. But one of the things I had always heard about coming in to that community was soul food. And I was really excited to taste soul food, wondering what soul food was, especially being from the North. And once I was invited to a number of meals along with Linda and got a taste for it, come to find out that the food portion of soul food was really Southern cooking. It just wasn't merely whether it was black or it was white or it was any other kind of ethnicity in the black community. No, it wasn't that at all. It was the food of the South, the real food that Southerners ate. But the soul dynamic, I come to find out, was the relationships that were taking place, the conversations that were being had while the food was being eaten. So thus, that's why it's called soul food. It's not the food, but it's the dynamic of relationships and emotions and friendships. And that was a powerful definer for me. And that has been something that has caused me to look at soul as that part of our lives that deals with our emotions, our relationships, and our friendships. And so, in this third part of our holistic formation series, we want to talk about relationships and friendships and emotions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Beth Davis and Nathan Davis. They are good friends. They have a huge background when it comes to Assemblies of God World Missions, and even Nathan before that as a psychologist for the United States Air Force. And they have been a huge blessing to so many missionaries. And I know in particular, when I was area director for Central Eurasia, they really spoke into the lives of our missionaries in a tremendous way. And I can also say personally, they were very instrumental in making sure that Linda and I stayed emotionally and mentally healthy as well. And so we're very thankful for them. And so with that, we're going to turn it over to Nathan and Beth, and today talk to us about holistic formation and the dynamic of soul.
I think a lot of people always think about, like you said, Mark, soul care is about we isolate it from our actual personal relationships, and it becomes all about prayer, devotions, and time spent with God, which is part of our spiritual formation. But I think without the foundation of relationships with others, which is part of the holistic formation, we don't really have a lot to stand on. I mean, God is always with us, but if we don't have that third component of having God working with us and others, we don't really have the strength of relationship. And as we have worked with people through the years in our time with AGWM, especially, we've noticed that people who are moving into depression or becoming lethargic in their fervor for God, when you get down deeper, they don't have friends. It's kind of a basic. You get to asking them, well, who are your people? Who are your core friendships? And many times that's the lacking component. And so it's not something that's over here if we have time to have friendships. It's right there with our personal walk with God. It just blends in. So with that, we thought we'd look today more at relationships with others as part of soul care.
Right. So there's a really good book by a guy named Fehr, F-E-H-R, in 1996, talking about relationships. And his research found out that what makes life meaningful is our relationships. And of course, for the Christian, that rests on relationship with God and ourselves, but also with others. And so we don't think about that. As Beth said, we kind of isolate that when actually relationships includes others as a part of what makes life meaningful. And so it was a really good research study by John Savage. And he looked at about, I think it was about 800 churches, and divided them into three groups of people. Those first, group one was those who were active in church. Group two are those who were in group one as active church members, but gradually became less active. And group three are those who actually left the church totally and became totally, or actually they didn't leave the church, they were in the church, but became totally inactive. And so, in looking at those three groups and trying to classify them, he found each group had increasingly severe bouts of conflict, either with the pastor or with each other in the church. And so those who had moved from being very active to being less active, they, about a third of them had moderate conflict with their pastor, and over 40% had conflict with either another church, with the pastor or another church member. And so that characterized group two. And in looking at group three, those who still were members in church but became totally inactive, over half of them had conflict with the pastor, and 46% had conflict with another church member. And so the reality was that conflict seemed to really characterize these two groups that moved to being less active and then totally inactive, basically just pew sitters. And it was characterized by the amount of conflict that they had with their fellow church member. They didn't differ in the theology that they had. They all had the same theology. What characterized those who became less active and inactive almost exclusively was the amount of conflict they had, either with the pastor or the church members. And they felt helpless to resolve their conflict and felt like their whole situation was hopeless. And so, I like to ask people, how, are you in one of those groups, becoming less active or moving into being totally inactive? And I like to ask people, does that conflict, is that a part of what moved you into one of those groups? And if so, then we need to do something about that, because naturally as Christians, we don't want to become less active or inactive. But I find even leaders in churches, sometimes when they have conflict with subordinates or peers within their church, they also react the same way. There was another pair of researchers called Rusin and Dudley in 2005. They looked at over 800 churches also, actually over 1,000 churches, and tried to characterize the churches and look at what was going on in their churches. The results said that the strongest correlate of growth was the absence of serious conflict. And that just speaks volumes. As evangelicals, we value growth, but we don't know how to stop conflict. And what really stops the conflict or stops the growth is that conflict. Christian Schwartz, in a book called Natural Church Development, said the unfeigned practical love has the divinely generated magnetic power that's far more effective than evangelistic programs.
Nathan, I'm reminded of the scripture where it says, when they observe the early church, see how they love one another.
Right, exactly. It goes right back to that. So, I want to say, what characterizes your house of relationship? The research shows that our house is built house of relationship is really built of three parts. The foundation being friendship and intimacy. On top of that, the main part of the house being respectful dialogue and knowing how to do that. and the roof being interdependence. That interdependence is really what we call creating a shared meaning within that house or relationship. And so often, my observation has been within the missionary community, within church community, within any one church, we have shared meaning, but we don't have the foundation of friendship or intimacy. We don't have any skills for respectful dialogue. I have a picture of a roof of a house being moved down a street in Honduras by about 40 men who are just carrying the roof from one location to the other. So many times that's us in the church. We have the roof, we have shared meeting, nothing else. We don't have any foundation of friendship or intimacy that ties us together. We have only shared meaning. We don't have respectful dialogue within our congregation because we don't have skills on how to do that. No one's ever taught us. You know, there's you go to Bible school. There's no courses on how to get along together, how to have good, strong relationships. We have all kinds of courses in theology and Bible, but none on how to get along. And so we end up being a church that's nothing but a roof that's supported by about 40 people carrying it. And eventually, guess what? It gets tiring. People start grumbling. They're carrying more load than the other guy. and it doesn't take long before everyone gives up. And they move to being inactive or totally inactive.
And if they just have the shared meaning and they don't have the intimacy of relationship and deep friendship, it's also easier to walk away. And so the more connected and the more you have the ability to get through conflict, because it comes to every relationship, we all know that. And if you don't have that fear of, oh, I don't want to talk about this, so instead I'm going to just leave this group that I'm working with. But if you have that confidence that you know how to get through this rough period, then you can stay and you can build that foundation.
So I guess I always tell people, let's get reflective about for a while and think about ourselves in our own relationships. Are we just a congregation of shared meeting and nothing else?
I think, and we just talked earlier to Mark about this, and I think that's kind of a time that we could just bring this in. A lot of people, after they retire from some kind of work that's related to the church or even in the marketplace, often the people that they've spent their whole life with, once they retire, there aren't any friendships left. It's all about they've shared meaning and they've worked for even common goals
for decades.
Yeah, sometimes. And then to their surprise, they come to maybe a new position or retirement or a move, and they don't have friends. And I don't know if you have heard this in your work, but we hear this quite often, that suddenly there's this gap, there's this hole, a loneliness that sets in. In fact, we have a neighbor that we just visited last night, who's a retired minister from another denomination. And he kind of begged us to come over, like, come over anytime, come 3 or 4 times a week. And it was very obvious that this person had no deep relationships after many years in ministry. And that was sad to think about that. But you can see how these components, if they're not developed along the way, there's not a lot left when the job ends.
So the house of relationship has to be more than just shared meeting.
Yeah.
We need dialogue, the ongoing dialogue that's respectful. And often we don't have the skills for that dialogue. We need a deep friendship. That's the basement. That's the foundation wall, is a friendship and intimacy with each other. But we often don't know how to go about doing that. And we assume that because we have shared meaning, that we automatically have everything else. And that's not true.
See if there are comments.
What kind of comments do you guys have for what we've talked about so far? Is this ringing your bell?
Mm-hmm.
I have a host of things going through my mind, thinking back to when I pastored in the city of Chicago, the church that we started, and then as a missionary and as an area director, and just going on through life and various other things in education and still in missions and so forth. But I look at these 3 points that you talk about with human relationships, friendships and intimacy, respectful dialogue, interdependence, and that it's not based on relationships are not based on shared meaning. That I think that's very profound because it seems in our institutions that we have, whether it's the church or its missions, and not just assemblies of God, but beyond. So much is based on shared meaning. And these other three areas, frankly, they take work. I mean, it'd be great to learn more about how to develop these areas. But something that came to mind is some guys I met in 1976 when I was a freshman at Evangel College, then college, now university. We take a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, almost every year and vacation together. And we took 2 weeks this past summer. And a lot of people will say, especially millennials and Gen Zs will say, how in the world do you do that? I mean, that long. And I think the element that makes it happen is just the intentionality. You've got to want to do it and invest yourself. And I didn't know that we were doing this, but really those 3 points are very much a part of those relationships. And none of them are in vocational ministry. But it's, to me, it's just such an alarm as to why perhaps we see more people leaving the ministry. We see people leaving missions. And perhaps it could be precluded if we had some thought and intentionality put into it. It's just a thought on my part.
Can I ask, Mark, if during these years of being together, do you have conflict with, has conflict come into that? You're probably, I don't know if you're living in the same place or if you see these people once a year, but talk about conflict. And if you had it, would you have the skills to address it because you have everything in place? I don't know.
We do have conflict, but it's a transparency. One of us in the years who was in ministry has become an atheist, but he's still my friend.
Yep.
He would do anything for you. And
Wow.
to me,
Wow.
I probably need to be his friend more than ever. But we have disagreements all the time about things. And not just merely superficial things, but some things that are pretty deep. But we've committed ourselves to the friendship, and we do have respectful dialogue. It does stay, and I think that's vitally important. Respectful dialogue. Very. We don't make it personal. We just try to speak the truth and love to each other. And I learn from him. I mean, there are things he says to me that I certainly learn about myself and then seek to change. But we enjoy being, with each other too. Sometimes you travel with, one time we traveled with, not sometimes, but one time the wives joined us and it totally changed the whole chemistry. There's something, I know I could get criticism for this, but I'm sure like when they're just women together, there's a certain dynamic and energy. That same thing happens when men come together. And we just have a very, very close bond. And now we're even stretching those relationships out to other that were in our life from 1976 and on our hall, cross hall at Evangel, 40 years ago. But
yeah, I'm going to assume too, Mark, I don't want to interrupt you, but I want to ask the question, are you have an atheist now in your group or agnostic, or I'm not sure what you said, but you might even have different political views, theological views. Am I right?
All of the above.
All of the above. And because of the underlying, Nathan's going to talk in a minute about create positive sentiment override. It sounds complicated, but it's not. It's because you have developed that intimacy and nourished it over the years as part of your soul care that now allows you to have respectful dialogue because you care so much about, as compared to, I know our country and our churches have been in kind of a bit of chaos over the past few years as we've moved politically through the COVID experience. There's been a lot of change in our churches, and And I think, again, I think without that connection relationally, it has caused a lot of hurt feelings, and because people haven't learned to come together and discuss and be allowed to have different opinions on different kinds of issues.
So let's talk a little bit about what builds intimacy, that foundation of any relationship. The foundation is built on friendship and intimacy. Let's talk about, there's really three major components, according to a researcher named John Gottman out of University of Seattle in Pacific, in Seattle, University,
Seattle Pacific
University. Couldn't get the name out. So he's one of the prime researchers in this area. And he says that friendship and intimacy is really built of three components. One is a deep knowledge of the other person's history, which you can only get by being around the person and having a dialogue. The second thing is a deep knowledge of the other person's personality. So not just a knowledge of facts, but you know what this personality is like. And it's expressed in a formula of history plus personality times what he calls positive sentiment override. Positive sentiment override means that when you disagree with someone, you have so much history and so much knowledge of their personality that you can overlook that minor conflict because you have positive sentiment about that person. And that's what we often, if you don't have the history and the knowledge, you can't have positive sentiment override. So I'm going to give an example. Our nation is polarized, right? How many Democrats do you know and Republicans do you know that can't talk to each other? They don't have positive sentiment override. They may know the other person history and have a deep knowledge of their personality even. And because of that knowledge, not in spite of it, there is no positive sentiment override. They cannot give the other person a benefit of a doubt and say, I can still be around you and talk to you and interface with you. We have, even in our church, the H, the history, and the P, the personality component. But we sometimes don't build that positive sentiment override. And I want you to think about a very simple formula on this. H plus P is times PSO, positive sentiment override. So whenever you have a times function, if that PSO is 0, what's the answer to that formula? A big fat 0. Yes. It's actually a formula.
And then it's time to walk away from that relationship. Am I right? Would that mean like it's not worth it?
That's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
We don't develop the positive sentiment override that ties it together and makes the formula work. When that PSO is 0, the entire formula is 0. And so, I encourage people to think about, okay, it's not just a matter of getting to know the person, but developing a friendship to the point where you can say, yes, we have disagreements, but I have positive sentiment override that says I value this person and I can talk to them and enjoy them and not try to change them. This kind of a friendship says, I'm delighted to see you as you are without change. The positive sentiment override is the key component that often, my experience has been that in my career as a minister, often we don't develop that. And that's foundational. Absolutely. It's part of intimacy. Without intimacy, without PSO, I don't have intimacy with my wife.
And I want to just say also, and then we need to hear from some of you if you're thinking about examples you might have, is that it takes time. Like you said earlier, Mark, it's like we are so busy working for the kingdom sometimes, whether as a volunteer or, wherever you fall in the line of working for God and his kingdom, it takes time. And sometimes we put so much more value on the bigger things, the flashier things, the more, that take up most of us. And we have so little left for this area of PSO that it's like, well, I'll get together with that person sometime, but it never happens without, like you said, Mark, the intentionality. And knowing that the values that we put on PSO are such kingdom value. It's saying, I honor you so much and respect you as another human being, regardless of how you think. And if it's different from me, then let's continue to dialogue. And we run from that and instead go and do something in the pulpit or do something that's going to be bigger and our maybe not as effective, but in our mind, it seems like it's more effective.
Yeah.
I've talked to some of you and some other people about a key characteristic that I have seen that others have pointed out to me even, called gaslighting. Gaslighting is prevalent in many places in ministry. Gaslighting points out to the lack of what? It means there's no PSO. Otherwise, people wouldn't talk about each other. And it's extremely prevalent in ministry. When you see gaslighting, it means PSO is zero. I've been there. I understand that. Any comments, insights by anyone? Jackie, I can see your lips moving.
But
I was just saying, let's see, I had to open. Okay, I do have a comment or a question. I don't know how you say that, but what happens then? You have dialogue, and you have dialogue, and maybe you lose some respect in the dialogue. All of a sudden, something changes in the dialogue, and when it has been respectful, because I mean that can happen too. You can have a good friendship or whatever, and then all of a sudden something seems to turn to crescendo.
Absolutely.
You have a foundation, you have friendship, you have intimacy, you've had respectful, and you've had interdependence on each other, but all of a sudden something in that formula, in those three things, like all of a sudden it isn't respectful dialogue. So
right,
assuming that breaks down the whole building, right?
All three of the components are really.
It's like a crack in the foundation, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Good point. Yes,
that's good. That's good.
And then if it's not restored, I'm assuming, or if you don't have the ability to do what you said, override, it becomes more than a crack, and it crumbles the foundation.
Right.
Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. You got a good insight there.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have the house of relationship that is composed of three parts. And any house, as it ages, what does it need? I live in a 100-year-old house. Guess what it needs all the time? Needs repair, needs maintenance. And so if you're not constantly repairing those crumbling foundations, crumbling walls, a sagging roof, whatever it is, an old house takes a lot of repair. And I can test a lot of bodily damage from that.
And yet, I think, Jackie, all of us know that are in this conversation that it takes two people to have a relationship. And so sometimes one person isn't willing to do the hard work. And, you may have built some good history and you may have a lot of good shared memories and meaning, but along the way, things happen. And sometimes people check out of a relationship or are not willing to be respectful. Maybe you haven't studied the same kinds of tools or used the same kinds of tools in the communication, and it can fall apart.
Yeah.
And then we'll ask, what happens then? Is that kind of where you are in this
The
question?
bottom line is that
Wait.
go ahead.
Well, no, I was just saying, so even though you have the building blocks in place, like the foundation, like those things, but if one of those, and I was, usually I would say, I don't know, but I would think that it would usually come from something going on with the dialogue.
Yeah.
That causes that's just I'm thinking, is that what usually is the beginning of the crack or whatever?
It could be any one of those three components, but the bottom line is that it takes two. First, someone has to start to initiate repair, and then it has to be recognized by the other individual.
Right.
Accepted. And so if that repair is not recognized, which it may not be, sometimes the relationship is going to be forced to dissolve, because it takes two, and one has to recognize it. We're not good at doing repair, and even less good at recognizing the attempts of someone else to repair.
And words can be spoken that can, as you know, you can't take back words. And so they're out there and they've lodged in our soul. I mean, that's what happens. It stays right there in our soul. And again, depending on the length of the history and the shared meaning that's gone on for how many years or a short time, both persons in the relationship weigh that out and say, wow, those words were spoken, they can't be taken back. So there's a lot of other variations of this little formula. But this kind of gives us a working tool of saying, let's pay attention to developing more than just the top layers.
And abuse will destroy PSO.
Yeah.
Regardless of how long.
Neglect or abuse, because all you have to do is go to, and you've been there, Mark, I know your name, and maybe you guys too, Davis, is if you've ever been to Cuba, you know what happens if you don't take care of buildings or you name it. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say that either, either neglect with a relationship, just like with a building, or lack of continuing with being respectful.
Abuse. Yeah. Anything that's abusive is going to really wear down the PSO, and eventually it's going to kill it. You can't just keep abusing a person. You can do it for a while. And some people have lots of PSO. I have a lot of PSO with my wife, and she has so much that she forgives. I can't believe how much she forgives me. But if I'm abusive,
it might all be over.
There you go. I agree with you, sister. So I get, and I would say that with family, with family, like I have a sister that definitely, if I didn't have PSO, if I didn't look over her, she's always my older sister and she lets me know it, but she's my sister.
Yes.
And I can go, in other words, but there are families, and we all know, who that's what happens. They break. Somehow they can't go on and forgive, and they won't even come together for Christmas or Thanksgiving or family. I mean, there's like, what do you call it? They literally don't see each other for years or communicate. I could never do that, but I'm saying that's because I love my sister and I know she loves me, but she has this thing that I'm your older sister and I have the right to do this to you or to say this to you.
So you have a huge bank of
PSO. Huge, probably bigger for her than I do my husband, because he doesn't.
Well, I have a brother-in-law who's a Georgia fan.
Oh boy, there you
go. So there is no positive sentiment override. And worse still, if he had been a Michigan fan.
Right, there you go. So anyway, okay, well, we've made our
I love that. No positive sentiment override with
Yeah.
Michigan fans. That works
so anyway, thank you. I just wanted to, kind of clarify how these things can happen.
Yeah. So I want you to understand that this actually is a formula. And the PSO is a times formula. And if it's times 0, it's over with. The foundation's
so much
gone.
to this that to me, this formula, these three things of human relationships, it gets down to, if we meet someone new and a relationship develops, you can almost sense within an intimacy. Hey, there's something about this person I enjoy being with. And
Mhm.
then the whole element of, hey, we had this great conversation and I can't wait to the next conversation. And then as that begins to develop, there's this interdependence. And that's how, to me, it sounds like a great formula for, as a rubric, to look at what is for a good friendship with somebody else as well.
Mhm.
I mean, it's very powerful at the personal level, but then if you think about it at the organizational level, whether it's a church or it's missionaries on a team or it's the marketplace where we're working, wow. I mean, these are things we need to be very conscious of. How do we foster them in these various situations that we're a part of? And then for it to develop that friendship and intimacy that develops with that knowledge and personality that leads then to that PSO. And if we're just saying, hey, we're here because we all rally around the mission statement, we're going to fall far short, whether it's the 16 fundamental truths or it's AGWM or it's IBM, whatever the acrostic may be.
Mm.
This is so, so powerful and insightful.
Okay, so
And I do have a question.
go ahead.
If friendship is the kind of the key to this, because that's really kind of what we're talking about, correct? And most, based on the reading I've done, most American guys, at least, can't say that they even have one friend.
Right, exactly. Good point, Don. That's
So-
exactly right.
So I feel like I was talking to a group in a Zoom meeting. I don't recall when this was. But I was talking about how I feel a lot of times I feel like I'm the guy that makes the call. Rarely am I called, but
Mhm.
I've just determined that I will continue to call
Mhm.
and initiate. That doesn't always bring, you can't do it based, if I initiate, I'm going to get something back. Maybe not. And a lot of times, probably not. But if no one ever initiates, and most, at least from what, even in ministry, I don't know that we really are good at making friends. We can make colleagues, we can make acquaintances in ministry, even in churches. But it's kind of a, I don't know if maybe it is a lost art because of our culture and the way it's structured. And but we were watching a program. My daughter said to me, she said, "Dad, I think we were watching It's a Wonderful Life." And at the very end, a man is who I think it says a man who is rich who has friends. And she looked at me and she said, "Man, Dad, you must really be a rich guy." She was little, and I hadn't really thought about it like that. But I do feel that way. But I feel like it takes an enormous amount of effort and initiative to get to that place. It doesn't happen by coincidence.
Right, right.
It takes a lot of repair attempts too.
Yes, but when you make all those investments, and invariably, those aren't all going to work. Those aren't all going to have a happy ending.
Right.
That's a little tougher to navigate. So sometimes it's just easier to say, you know what, it's just not, I'm good. I'm good.
Especially when there's ongoing abuse. When there's ongoing abuse, the PSO eventually gets killed, and people just go their separate ways because they're trying to preserve themselves, actually. And so most of us have been especially by my age, most of us have been there multiple times where you meet someone who's abusive, and initially you may feel close, but the abuse starts coming through, and eventually you got to say, to preserve yourself, you may want to terminate the relationship because that abuse may continue.
But if you don't have if that, to me, the respectful dialogue is a key, because there are times when I'm disrespectful.
Right.
Yes.
Exactly.
On me, and can I go back? And what you said, Beth, is so critical. You can't put, you can't put the stuff back into Pandora's box. Once you've said it, it's
Out there.
said, and you can't unhear it, you can't unring it. But wow, I always just try to be conscious. I wonder who what collateral damage I've left along the way, unintentionally or sometimes it's intentional. You know, if it's a Michigan fan, it's probably intentional. Otherwise, it's probably unintentional. And I may never know that if there's no meaningful, respectful dialogue, and that person can't come to me and say, Don, that was not right. That was not respectful.
Good insights, guys. Good
So
insights.
so how do you develop those? So the question, how do you develop those skills then, or hone those skills? Because I think we all innate, well, maybe we don't all innately have those. I think we innately have them.
No, we don't. We have a fallacy in ministry anyway. We think that because a person's a Christian that they automatically have those skills.
Right.
And that's untrue. I mean, that is a total fallacy. Just because you're a Christian, just because you're a minister, doesn't mean you have those skills. It means that you have to develop those skills just like anyone else. And unfortunately, like I said, we don't have any courses in our Bible schools or colleges to teach those skills. We'll teach Bible. We'll teach the 16 fundamentals. We don't teach people how to get along. So if for those who are interested in that, I'm not trying to push my own stuff, but you know, Beth and I did write a book called Transforming Conflict that starts off with the skills. The stuff we're talking about now is the last chapter after you have the skills, because as Don said, if you don't have the basic skills, you know, your friendship's not going to last too long because you won't be respectful. Respectful dialogue won't be there. And so you may try to develop the foundation, but it takes all three to really to build a house. You can't have a house without a roof, without walls, or without a foundation. It takes all three to really call it a house. And so the PSO is what we often don't think about. And that's why I'm hitting on it so hard. But Don is exactly right. Those walls, you know, if you just have a foundation and a roof, that's not much of a house. It's hard to live in that.
And even the learning how to respect the other takes time and skill. To learn to when you just have to stop talking, for instance. I think in our culture of we work with so many people who are on the stage all the time. They become very used to being the one that's in the speaker seat, and relationships develop, I believe, primarily by listening, by starting out by learning to listen to another person's history, to validate the other person. And that's the loving the other, you know, that's part of our soul care, is just that stepping back. I think it's Dale Carnegie has some kind of a statement that you will never lack friends if you learn to listen. Yeah, just there's plenty of people out there that will talk to you. And that's probably why we grow weary of so much. We have so much because there's words everywhere to us, but for people to just be with us and ask us questions, that's a gift if we can give that to another person. So I feel like that is such the basic part of respect, is to respect the other person enough to sit back and take in their story.
Okay, I'm not going to talk about the roof, shared meaning, because that's what generally we have shared meaning when we go into this relationship. If you're in ministry at all, you have shared meeting with another minister or your congregation, with your members. So that almost comes. But what we don't have is what Don mentioned. We don't have respect. And it really hits me. I was an MK raised in Japan, not born there, but raised there. And in Japan, the depth of your bow shows your respect. And so if you're in a leadership position, you may just nod at the person. But when you have deep respect, the Japanese person will bow at waist level, all the way over at waist level, and then hold it right there. and maybe for 15 or 20 seconds, just stand in that position. And it shows such deep respect in body language. So the respect also has a formula. It's composed of 3 parts. A is how much I esteem the other person. B is how much I trust them. And C is your communication skills. And that's a timed function, just like the other. In other words, if one of those is 0, if you don't have communication skills, the whole thing's going to be 0. As Don mentioned, it's eventually going to come to 0. If you don't have esteem or trust, the whole thing goes to 0. It's a times function where something times 0 is 0. It takes all 3 components to build respect. And unfortunately, in our culture in North America, we don't talk about respect. We don't value that so much as we do in many other cultures. And so the average North American goes through life having shared meaning, as we do in ministry often, but not having a clue how to build respect with each other, and not doing a first lick of work, because it does take work to build trust. We destroy the trust so quickly sometimes, or the work it takes to build communication and develop communication skills, as Don mentioned. It's built on having those skills. If you don't have the trust, if you don't have the skills, it's all 0. Any insights?
I was thinking of different kinds of churches. I'm going to be doing a series for our church in Philippians all of January, or at least 4 weeks of January. And I always thought, especially when I pastor, that I would love to pastor a Philippian church, and you could keep the Corinthian church with all the bells and whistles because of all the conflict and people suing each other, and all these gifts were active, but yet there was imbalance there. But I think even in looking at scripture, these things that you're talking about are all biblical truths that can be applied. They become a great grid for really looking at the health of relationships, and how we need to develop relationships and foster them and keep them going.
We have a misconception sometimes about the idea of forgiveness. We think that because we ask forgiveness that we're automatically going to get respect. You don't get respect and trust, or trust. Those are built with time. And forgiveness gets the process started, but it takes hard work and time to build the respect.
So are you saying that forgiveness is a starting point, not an ending point?
Forgiveness is a starting point, and
Wow.
trust takes time to build.
Okay, so why does it take us sometimes so long to get to forgiveness? Some people go their whole life and never get to forgiveness.
Right, yeah.
And if it's a starting point, it has to be the foundational, correct?
It's foundational. It's a foundational starting point, but to build the respect and trust takes time and lots of work. And it takes a step of faith. Mark has a real good example about someone who started that. And Mark, I invite you to share that story if you're willing.
And could you remind me which one that is?
There's so many people. It's about a basketball player. About a very tall basketball player.
I don't know.
Yeah. I'll share it briefly. So I was in Dallas finishing up a class for my spiritual direction certification at Southern Methodist University. And Donald, I wanted to see Ohio State play Wisconsin at the Big Ten championship game, and the Airbnb I was staying in didn't have that, and so I called around and I found like a sports bar that actually was going to show the whole game, and they had places you could sit and watch the game of your choice. I thought that sounds great, so I went there, and there were a couple other chairs in front of this beautiful big flat screen. Place was packed. Nobody in those two chairs because the Ohio State Wisconsin game was on, and this is in Dallas, Texas. Nobody cares. And so I sat down. All of a sudden, this fellow, a large African American man, probably about 6'9", comes in, plops into the chair, and says, "Hey man, how you doing?" I go, "Great." He goes, "Who are you for?" I said, "Well, I'm from Ohio, so I'm for the Buckeyes." He goes, "Oh man, that's great. Yeah, I'm from Ohio too. Where are you from?" I told him where. We're from the same city, Dayton, Ohio. And I introduced myself. He introduced himself as Big Tex. He had played in the NBA. And so he was F bombing everything because Ohio State did not start the game well, though we eventually won. And he said at the commercial break, "So why are you here?" And I said, where do you live? And I said, "Well, I live in Springfield, Missouri." He says, "Oh, you're not from Dallas." I said, "No, I'm down here at SMU doing a certification program in spiritual direction." And he goes, "What's that? Some kind of new age stuff?" And I said, "No." Well, one thing led to another in conversation, and he began to open up spiritually, and he began to tell me about he was engaged. He made sure I knew that he was not having sex with his fiancee. They were going through premarital counseling, but then he started talking about his ex-wife who had committed adultery on him. They had a daughter together, and he was very bitter and angry. And so, as he talked about it, he said to me, "You know, Mark, I could stand before God Himself someday." And he knew the gospel, and I shared the gospel with him. He knew the gospel, and he says, "I would tell God I can't forgive her what she did for me to me." And I said, "Well, let me ask you, Tex, how is that helping you? And how is that helping your daughter? And you're going into a new marriage, and how is this going to help your new marriage?" I said, "With your daughter, this woman is always going to be her mother. So there's always going to be that connection there." I said, "You know, the thing you need to do every time you think of her is to invite Jesus into her life and to release her to Jesus." I call it the release prayer. So this woman's name, I'll call her Karina. I said, "Just pray this prayer. Is, you know, Jesus, I welcome you into Karina's life. I release her to you." He said, "What did you say?" I repeated myself. I said, "Now you say it." And he prayed the prayer. And all of a sudden, this 6'9" guy in the middle of this sports bar jumps up and puts his hands above his head and says, "I'm free. I feel so free right now by doing that. I can't believe how free I feel for releasing her." I said, "Yeah, it's going to come back negatively. You know, the enemy's going to try to beat you down with this, but you keep praying this prayer, keep releasing, welcoming her into Jesus, welcoming Jesus into her life and releasing her to Him, and you'll be free from the bondage." And anyway, he did, and he had this scarf on, said Chicago Fire. Well, I pastored a long time in Chicago, professional soccer team, and "I want you to have this scarf." And I said, "Well, I really don't need the scarf. Thanks anyway." "No, no, I want you to have it to remember me." I said, "No, no, no, thanks. I don't want the scarf." He goes, "Please take the scarf so you remember me." I said, "Okay, I'll take the scarf." So I took the scarf, and then he goes, "My fiance works for the Chicago Fire. I got like 12 of these at home." But the thing is to see this fellow in this very public place, crowded with particularly other men there, he just was exuding with joy because he felt through praying that simple prayer, giving her forgiveness. And then would he go back and trust her? I doubt it, but at least they could have a civil relationship, especially for the sake of his daughter and for the benefit of his new marriage and also for his soul. Because it's like Hebrews says, the root of bitterness, unforgiveness does, primarily unforgiveness, does defile many.
Good insight, Don. Thanks for the story, Mark. Any other insights?
You know, Nathan and Beth, we are closing in on our hour, and we want to limit it to that. I don't know, perhaps we could talk about a part two of this if there's more to share. But I think that the information that you have shared with us and the contributions others have made have just really been extremely helpful. I know I've gotten some new rubrics for my own thoughts, and also understanding why the relationship with my friends from college works so well. It's more than just picking up the phone, but there's a whole bunch of dynamics behind it that make it work. And then just this other information that you've shared on the dynamic um, of
If you're interested in relationship skills, like Don mentioned, you know, because that house of relationship, the middle of it is communication skills. And people say, you know, what are those skills? Well, Beth and I, in our book on called Transforming Conflict, it's available on Amazon. If you look under Nathan Davis, you'll find there's 10 billion Nathan Davises on Amazon. So you have to look for Nathan Davis and then use the book title Transforming Conflict in order to find it. But we start off with 10 communication skills that are guys like these because they don't like touchy-feely stuff. These are hard, concrete skills that they can learn and develop with time. And so it's all doable. And so if you're interested in following up on the communication skills that Don alluded to and talked about, we talk about 10 different communication skills. We don't get into this stuff we talked about here until chapter 5. But of course, it's all in there. And so we probably don't need to have another follow-up session. You know, just go ahead and look through the book on your own time. It's a self-study. It is very detailed. It's all based in research. And so I invite you, if you're interested in that, you can go ahead and follow up on your own time.
Okay. Yeah, I would encourage getting that book. Nathan and Beth are prolific writers and have produced so much stuff. Go to Amazon and take a look. Let me just say that our first 2 holistic formation webinars on mind and body and mind are in the archive at www.imwholeness.org, imwholeness.org. This will be archived there. Our next session that we're going to be having with Nathan and Beth is going to be on January the 3rd. And we're going to be talking about holistic formation and the spirit. So we're going to be talking more about traditional spiritual formation. And the idea is in these 4 areas of holistic formation, body, mind, soul, and spirit, that they all work together for us to be completely who we are in Christ. We can't bifurcate, trifurcate, quadrifurcate ourselves into different parts, but these are all functioning together, especially as we're living in a fallen world with a fallen nature. All of these things have to be working together for us to be all that God would have us to be. And just as we talked about today with soul and relationships, so vitally important. In my spiritual direction practice, I usually do a rubric of body, mind, soul, and spirit when I start a formation, or excuse me, a direction relationship. And I'm very surprised for people that are in ministry, missions, the marketplace, how many have no friendships. And it's almost unbelievable because they're the kind of person you think, well, I would love to connect with this person, but they don't. And that's a part of helping them along too. And we've seen some very good things happen. Let me also say, so January the 3rd at 10 a.m. Central Time will be the webinar on spiritual formation. And then starting the very next week, January 10th, 17th, 24th, and 31st, we are going to be doing a 4-part series with Nathan and Beth and Dr. Grant Jones. And the whole series is going to be on spiritual abuse. And just to give you a bit of an idea of the topics that we're going to be dealing with, these topics we'll be covering January 10th. We'll be talking about spiritual abuse. What are the signs and symptoms? On January the 17th, we'll be talking about spiritual abuse. What are the signs and symptoms of a spiritual abuser? And then January 24th will be spiritual abuse stories from the spiritually abused. And we'll be doing some live interviews with Nathan, Beth, and Dr. Grant Jones with people who have gone through spiritual abuse and who are survivors and also in the midst of recovering from spiritual abuse. And then lastly, on January the 31st, we'll be talking about spiritual abuse, steps to healing for individuals and for organizations. And we're not going to be pointing out any particular organizations, but we're talking about the topic overall because it's a very, very large problem that's within the church, it's within missions, it's in the marketplace. So oddly enough, and interestingly enough, January is Spiritual Abuse Month. I never realized that there was such a month, and I actually Googled it and come to find out that there is. So we wanted to make sure that we really zeroed in January on this particular area where we can reflect on these things. And I think too, for those of us that are in leadership roles, to allow it to speak to us, perhaps we are abusing people or have abused people, and to make sure that we may need to go back and make some relationships right. I had to do that 2 years ago with a person I worked with in ministry just out of seminary that was very challenging, and had to have a conversation with him in a very kind way as a son speaking to a father. So those are the things that are coming up on our webinars. We're going to be populating that site with many more things, innermost.org. And if there's any interest you may have in a spiritual direction relationship, please feel free to write me at info at imwholeness.org, and I'll be happy to be able to respond to that. We also have a free course that we have many people signing up for on holistic formation. So I'm going to be providing a free course on this. I asked Nathan and Beth to come in at times and to help me with some of the teaching. And that was just recently, so I'll be waiting for their reply, but we're also planning that. Just go to the website and you can sign up for it. Everything's there. That's the landing page. Well, I'm going to thank you, Nathan and Beth. This has been great. I love the information. I'm going to be back and reflecting on it more and more. Again, this will be put on the archive. So if you know of anyone that you think would benefit from this, please push it out to them, because the idea is that we want to see people holistically formed to be the women and men of God that he would have them to be. And so thanks a lot. And we'll see you again in January. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Right.